This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial. And
Dave on the board.
a lot of things to cover today. Probably won't get through all of them. That's okay. Firstly, I learned that Bill Gorin had passed, so I will say something in passing. The Common Ground has a new location or an additional location in Champaign. I'm dealing with the mop bucket, which we dealt with last week because it's a mop bucket that costs $153, and it has a bad wheel or two. Do we repair it or do we throw it in the garbage? This recycling of plastic, recycling of paper, which is very positive this week. We did boneyard field trip, and then with the Natural Area Study Group, they did a boneyard trip. And I called my brother in Australia, and if we have time, I'll mention that too. Well, firstly, in passing, Bill Gorin. He has had a long association with us next door. He graduated about the time that Vietnam was here, and a lot of people were thinking about doing cooperative things. So you had stores, you had garages, all sort of earthworks labeled, and Bill was involved in that. There were lots of protests at the time. I looked out. I'd come into this sort of area. I'd been working with the school science curriculum project, and we ended up with occupying space over by the WIL radio station. There were two storefronts there. One was an old Piggly Wiggly store, which became an Eisner store, and then it closed out. So the university had rented that space, or actually bought it, I think. And then there was another store next door which dealt with clothing and dry cleaning and things like that. After a while, those two stores became Ed 2, an interesting attempt by the Banner public school system to have a second-level school for people who were alternative. After a while, we were moved to the curriculum laboratory, which had two or three houses near the university high school. They were on the same side of the street, and they were adjunct to the curriculum lab run by Mr. Beatman, and with new math and things like that. So Bill was around when we were doing these things, and Education 2 expanded into the second storefront, so there were two storefronts with Education 2. While we were there and adjacent to the first Ed 2, we were partners in many ways. The school system was providing for people who didn't quite fit into the traditional school system. They may be people who were very active in mind, that had a different way of doing things. Maybe they had some behavioral problems. Some were pregnant at the time, and I really give Urbana credit for letting those people continue their high school education. At times we had lots of vegetation, field trips to different places, And there was a group of people there that got together. They included Bill Goran and Don Kurtz and Fred Schrumpf. And they were three of the major pushers. And they learned that by doing. Sometimes it was a little surprising. I had a video camera, which I remember was very big at the time. We now have video cameras that are very small. But this was a fairly large video camera, and it came running down the street on a motorcycle, riding on one wheel and taking photographs as it was going. So we had some interesting activities that were certainly alternative. But Bill was there, and he had worked with and was a founder of Earthworks store. It was where the university now has a hydraulics building, and it had a yard, and that's where some of this area started to do recycling. They were recycling glass, and there were groups that were around that were added in. One was housewives interested in pollution solution. And then a couple of males got involved, including Dan McCollum, who was later to be mayor of Champaign for 11 years. And they would send glass off to Streeter for recycling. It got to be realized that this was a major problem, and it also got realized that this was it was voluminous. So that meant that you had to break the bottles so you had a decent load to take to the glass works. A lot of electricity tied up in glass. You can get glass made from sand, but you still have to spend energy to make it. So recycling is a good deal. We're sort of amazed that often the local bar bottles go to the landfill, and they're not even sorted so that you can have a mountain of glass, which would be interesting to do. Urbana actually does have a mountain of glass, and people are going through it at the moment looking for antique glass, because this mound was made early in the century. So Bill was there, and eventually that Earthworks store became Strawberry Fields and moved to Urbana. And one of the spin-offs was of the same sort of era was the Common Ground Co-op, which was a different spin-off from Earthworks. And now it has been so popular in Urbana, where they've moved to the early Urbana Mall, which is a fairly small mall, but it was one of the first at the end of Green Street. And they've done very well, and they're looking for a new place in Champaign. I was there a couple of nights ago and said, I asked the cashier, what's the thinking of the place to be in Champaign? Because I've been interested in the north of Market Street. You have to know that WEFT is on Market Street. We're talking from Market Street right now. And it runs into Main Street. And north of there's a bunch of railroad yards. And the Black Dog Saloon has taken over the old railroad station. There's still the big 1923 railroad station that is occupied by a lot of people. And so there's sort of a movement a little north of town. The old Illinois Central building is there. It's where the electricity was generated for the interurban things, and there's some open space there, and but this acquisition was announced the very night I talked to the young lady, and she said, well, at 12 o'clock they're going to announce where. And the announced where was 500 North Washington. And if you know, that's right opposite PACA, the Preservation and Conservation Organization. It's on Washington Street. It has been various car places, and it has a yard. So just a little while ago, I hopped in the car and ran up there to just verify where they are. And there's a big sign that says future home of the Champaign Common Ground Co-op.
Actually, the street is Walnut. Walnut. The exact place where there's currently an Amish furniture store. The plan is apparently that the Amish furniture people will move somewhere else in that little complex there, so they'll both coexist. And this new space for the co-op will actually be larger than the co-op over in downtown Urbana. So yeah, but it's on Walnut Street, the one that comes right past us here, going one way north.
It's just parallel to Market.
Yes, exactly. Perpendicular. It's a north and south running street, right?
Yes.
Anyway, so yeah, 5 blocks north of University.
1 block west of Market Street.
Anyway, no matter where it goes in, it's going to be interesting to have it there, and it's going to be just north of where WEFT is. So back to you, Dave.
Yes, well, that speaks why there's an Amish truck sitting there at the moment. And thank you for that addition. But yeah, go back to Bill Garan and Don Kurtz and Fred Schrumpf and early Earthworks. The Earthworks garage was over more towards Champaign. It was on First Street or near to First Street. And there was an attempt to think differently, and co-ops were encouraged, and they've continued through. Just a few of them. Some involved law and legal justice and things like that. At one stage, I looked out at my curriculum lab old house that we were occupying, and there were wall-to-wall National Guard troopers with bayonets all lined up, because the students were fairly adamant that the Advanced Competition Building, which was built to work with the Army, was not going to do that on campus. And eventually that did change. The SIL, Army Corps of Engineers Research Lab, moved to the research park west of Champaign, and it still works a lot with the university, but it is independent, and that's sort of what the students were wanting. So Bill was in this era, and he thought a lot about things like field trips. He and Donnie came to my reading the landscape class at Parkland, and we went on field trips, and some of this spilled over into the education too. Eventually, these characters that had got to work with this school in a very innovative manner got caught up with state regulations, and they had to go and get education qualifications so that they could continue to teach. We had been there early, but had moved to the curriculum lab, and they could still work with us. Right across from the curriculum lab, there was a little house. It was obviously different from the 2- and 3-story houses that were on that road. One was the Botany Annex with a bunch of greenhouses behind it, and there was a quasi-sorority in a 3-story house, and there were several houses there. Eventually, the university was getting ready to put in a huge university engineering library. It's called the Granger Library, and they were looking for open space, parking space. And this little house was a little weird. We deal with weird things. Sometimes they're not so weird. This was a house that had been dragged across on the snow when the area around University High School was cornfield. So you have to figure that Urbana was still developing, early settlement, very early settlement, and mainly people moved on because it was flat and swampy, and malaria was around. So the early settlers moved on to places like Peoria, a little higher and drier. But gradually there was settlement in the Big Grove, northwest of Urbana, and that was probably the little house we're talking about. It was called a Little Dome House. I think Domey was a family here. It's a D-O-E, I think, D-O-E-M-E. It pops up every so often. This is part of our history. It looked different, it was different, and it was probably there before there were ever any three-story houses. It was there because people would come to town from the east, part of the Yale band, for instance. People were coming east and looking at how to put education into the Midwest, and had quite a battle to have the location in Champaign. One of the things that affected it was that a number of these people were church people, especially Congregationalists, Universalists, Unitarians, people who are often a little on the thinking side and dreaming side, and they had some of their churches. One was well known as the Goose Lake Church, which is right almost outside of WEFT door on the other side of the railroad line. But these days, the railroad line was closer to WEFT when it was raised up to put underpasses on so traffic wouldn't have to wait for trains. They pull the railroad to the east a little bit. But we're talking about perhaps 1870. This house may have been put up in the area of Broadway in Urbana. If you fish around Urbana, you'll find out that there was a county fairground there. I don't know how long it was there, but the Broadway was a sort of assembly for Urbana. Really, Urbana was slated to start up by the Big Grove, but somebody bought land further down, and you know what happens when somebody has that sort of resource. It tended to come down to where we are now in Urbana, and the railroad came through on the west. So we are talking about the railroad coming about 1855, the Civil War coming, and this cottage probably was installed. It might have been installed in the 1850s, actually, or if we don't really know. We know that by titles it came from male to male to male. Females didn't fit into this picture at the moment. Females certainly didn't have a vote at that moment. So it was very much a male thing. And the person who came knew about architecture. There was a nice little dado which said, "I know my architecture." There was a front porch, which we call a Greek Revival cottage porch, and 4 rooms. And originally they would have had a lounge room in the middle, and that lounge room would have a hole cut into it, and a pot-bellied stove would sit in the middle and warm all 4 rooms. The rooms did not have doors. They had curtains for privacy. But if you wanted warmth, you opened the curtain and the warmth filtered through. 2 of the rooms were sort of square, and they were bedrooms, a master bedroom and an associate bedroom. And there was a hallway down. Traditionally, that was a good thing to have, as you met your friends and relatives in the front foyer, which was a hall. And on either side of the door, there would be plate glass windows and light from nature. and then that would lead into the room that was probably part a lounge room. One of the squares was a bathroom, and one of the squares was a kitchen. Well, we looked at this, and Bill Gorin was involved in this too. We thought it was a fairly unique cottage, and it should be preserved. Well, Mr. Briscoe, who was a professor of engineering and in charge of physical plant at the time, didn't have a lot of feeling for this, because this was an old building that had been skidded across the snow into the cornfields about where the university started. The university started with a religious event that didn't succeed. It was a seminary, and so that it was in the location of the Union. It was eventually taken down because it kind of fell down. It was dangerous. But this was a good reason for the state arguments about where the university would start. And that little house at that time, the boneyard, would be quite natural. And up on the hill, there was this little dome house. And other people would get their houses out into the field and rent them out. So this was probably a rental house. We didn't know about its architectural history, but there was a person who lived in it who sharpened saws and did carpentry. And he would sit on the front stoop, and under the front stoop, when the house was taken out, we found all sorts of interesting beer bottles, and not so much beer bottles, but whiskey. And whiskey in the early days, you couldn't travel with a horse and cart. You couldn't cart a lot of grain. So whiskey was a way of economically moving product. And so even people who were church-oriented, like Mennonites, would still move whiskey. They might not drink it, but they would move it. So this little house sat there, and we asked questions about it. But Bill got some of the Ed 2 students to come and investigate the Greek Revival Cottage. It was eventually called the Greek Revival Cottage because we wanted this cottage to be preserved. And if you work with the architects, they're going to look at its quality from an aesthetic point of view. And to call it the saw sharpener's house was not enough. So it was the Greek Revival Cottage, and we tried to move it. At the time, Champaign was putting in a toy agricultural petting zoo, friendly place where people could see animals and enjoy, and they wanted a house to go with that. But they really wanted a house where you could have students have a war cry in the middle of it and so bounce up and down. And if you walked into this cottage and walked into the lounge room, it was kind of loose. You could see the reaction in the surrounding walls. Eventually, when the house was moved from its original location in Urbana, it was floored. The middle part was floored, so it became a lounge room, and there are other ways of heating. They dug a little basement out, so there was a washing machine in a rough dirt basement that was underneath the Greek Revival Cottage. And there was a question about an addition. When the family had children, they needed more room, so they added a 2-story addition to the back of it. And the question was, if you're architecturally purist, the Greek Revival Cottage was a different cat than the addition. Should we not take the addition? And eventually we argued that the addition was part of the dynamics of the history and that it should go too. So it didn't go to Champaign because it wasn't strong enough. It was weak. Mr. Briscoe, who was the physical plant person, and Mr. Stallman, I think it was, that was in charge of space utilization, had real questions about this. We were in the era of removing this house, and we talked to the Historic Museum. Here's a little bit more history. The Urbana Free Library had become a sort of historical place of note, and Nell Carpenter had the temerity to make it almost a national level place for history, and just to be given quite a deal of credit for that. But it really wasn't what a library was about. It was making a library into a specialist library. So it remains as such. And so you can go to the Urbana Free Library and do things. Well, the historic people had a split, and they made a historic museum. And they wanted a museum. And so Bud Baker and others got together, and they bought a house on University Avenue. This was a house which is a big house, generated for the daughter of an early citizen, and it had a huge ballroom on the top. It had facilities for the daughter's activity, which was making ceramics, and it had a coach house out the back, and it was ideal for a museum. So that museum sponsored the purchase of the Greek Revival Cottage. I don't know what we paid for it. It probably was a university transfer for $1 or something like that. But then it had to be moved. So the Urbana Park District was consulted, and it was decided to put it in Leal Park. Leal Park, if you go down University Avenue, Leal Park is on the south side, just east of Carle Hospital. Carle Hospital in those days was an old house, and it lasted for a long time while its buildings built around it. It has only been in the last 20 years that the central house was removed completely. And so Leal Park was near to Crystal Lake Park. The street that runs down the side of Leal Park was really ran directly into Crystal Lake Park. The cemetery is small. It was owned by the Busey family, and it was eventually decided to close the cemetery. You got the chance to remove your relatives' remains, or you turned down the stone on the grave and left things as they were. There were 2 Indian burials there, and that's rather important because Indian burials are federally protected, and you dare not to dig them up or disturb them. So all these little pieces of information were going together, and some of them were infusing into it too. And so eventually, the Urbana Park District gave a location, and interestingly, that house eventually has become the Park District's headquarters. So Mr. Ginsel from Buckley Loader area was employed to move the building. That meant that you first of all had to jack the building up. If you're jacking the building up, you have to jack it up carefully. It has to be evenly jacked up, or the house will do a dance, and you won't have a house anymore. So very carefully, hydraulic jacks to lift the house up high enough to put I-beams underneath it, and then to take airline bogies with smaller wheels on and tie them onto the I-beams, and then drag that house out slowly with a tug. A tug is a truck that has been had its gears adapted so they're very strong. And in this case, they had an additional front tug in front of the regular tug. And Grandma drove the tug, if I remember rightly. And they gradually moved this cottage out. Yes.
And before we go any further and find out what happens to the cottage, we're at about the halfway point here in the show, so we should do something that we often forget to do, which is to let folks remind folks that this is WEFT Champaign, 90.1 FM. This is the Prairie Monk, where you hear about things environmental and conservational, and in this case, historical as well. And we'll maybe put in a really quick mention that at the very end of this month, we're only about 1 week away now from our Spring Pledge Drive. So if you enjoy hearing Dave every week on this show, plus the other entire week of music and everything that we bring you here, please consider making a donation. It's only a pledge when you call us and let us know, and within the next couple of months, give us your money so that we can actually stay on the air and be here years and years and years to continue reminding you of what came before and to help you consider what comes after. And with that, where are we now with moving that house?
We moved the house down Springfield Avenue, which was an interesting street. It wasn't Springfield Avenue. It was Bloomington Road at one stage, and it was actually an old Indian trail. So as it goes through town, it goes kitty corner towards Bloomington. Down to Wright Street, up Wright Street, onto University Avenue, down to Leal Park, and there the foundations were set, not just to put the house down, but to allow there to be underneath the house room for those 4 rooms. It was to store historic items, to provide for teaching. So the foundations were put down without problems, and the center part remained there. They took the railroad ties and spread them out so that the machinery could sort of come across that space like with a bridge, and then the jacks again were used to drop the house down, or first up to remove the wheels, and then down onto the foundations. Then we had to dig out the area underneath, which was to become the basement. When we did that, we actually started to dig bones. So we had to get the coroner to come, and then the Department of the coroner came, the Department of Archaeology and Anthropology, Tom Riley came, and we did a formal dig to find out whether this could be an Indian grave or whether it had a shroud and a coffin, and it was definitely not. It was definitely not. And so this was an experience not only for us at Educational Resources in Environmental Science, but it was also an experience for Ed too, and for people at the museum. The museum owned the house. The Park District owned the ground under the house. Eventually, that got to be a problem, so the Park District now owns the house, and that's the Park District headquarters. But that very much reminds me of Bill Gorin and the role that he played in this sort of thing. They did a lot of field trips, and one of those field trips went to Guadalupe, a Big Bend in Texas. And so the students got to roam around this dry area place, and Bill and Don Kurtz, who are the leaders, put together a trail guide. And we were putting together things like this here for Brownfield Woods, and so that was part of an experience where we were sort of jointly doing things, and they produced a nice little trail guide, and the National Park Service took it on, and it still sells as a trail guide to that area. So once again, Bill was involved. We eventually moved to Kenny Gym to be part of recreation, and I taught outdoor education, and again, Bill was there. And at that time, we got Comprehensive Employment Training Act money, and as a result of that, we had various secretarial assistances, and we had Wilma. And Wilma, who came with depression that we didn't know about, as long as she was on her lithium pills, she was very good. But if not, she was kind of welcoming everyone at the front door with a hug, and that was, we didn't quite know what to do about that. Cedar didn't really tell us that Wilma had a problem, but Wilma was very historic, and she loved being with us, and we liked having Wilma, and it was a challenge for the federal agency because they wanted numbers of people through. So you got someone from Cedar for a period and then handed that on to another person, and so on. But we wanted to retain Wilma, and Bill was a part of that. Bill, for many years, he and his family looked after Wilma when the project that Wilma belonged to was long since over. She was still around and in a nursing home, and Bill looked after Wilma. And so then, by this time, Bill got into geography, and he got a master's degree in geography, and then he tied on a soils master's too. And he was getting to know about the landscape. He was being employed by the Army Corps of Engineers, and eventually became the sustainable environmental sustainability center there was his charge. So we had a relationship there continuing, and often questions. And Bill was a runner, and he would appear at our Rattlesnake Master, Run for the Prairie. But most of all, Bill put together a 501c3 for us. We haven't, I have to apologize, we haven't totally continued that, mainly because we just haven't had the person power to do it. But it has been behind things like the rail trail to Kickapoo Trail from Urbana to Danville, and a bunch of other things like the 33 miles of railroad bed that we have in the Monticello area. So Bill has been helpful. He has been also a family person, a church person, and a person that looks after juvenile justice. So he was on a CASA committee where he would present a case for someone who didn't have someone to present a case. He married Jenny, and Jenny is they're both very involved with church activities and the Judeo-Christian school and Methodist Church on Mattis Avenue, from which Bill was, his memorial service was there. And I missed it. I didn't know about this till just this coming Friday, this Friday, last Friday. Bill's family they had 3 children, and Josh, the first one, is getting a PhD or got a PhD in chemistry in Texas. The next one is a minister, and the next one is a wood technologist. So they've done well. He has 5 grandchildren, and wonderful family experience, and that includes sport and travel. David and I have to look at my notes here too. So David and Shannon, yes, they went to Russia as missionaries, and Bill and Jenny visited there, and they've become the babysitters for family. Unfortunately, Bill got lymphoma, and it's a cancer of the lymph system. Yes, and it spread around, and so he's had a 2-year battle with that and has lost out. But we respect Bill and the things he has done with the Army Corps of Engineers. He's done worldwide stuff and got awards for doing that. And we'll miss Bill a lot. And the Greek Revival Cottage was just one example of where we would work together. And I very much remember his students, after the house had been removed, they were there digging in the house to find out what was under the front stoop. That was mainly alcohol that was on the swinging deck, and the Greek Revival Cottage was probably where the Saw Sharpener enjoyed his afternoon. And we were directed by the historic people to look at this southeast corner where the outdoor toilet was, because in their day, the outdoor toilet was where you put your broken glass or broken crockery and things like that. And a whole lot of history can come out of the toilet situation. But there were the students digging in the dirt, and this was very different from talking to Professor that was in charge of the process of moving that house. Actually, the next door house, which is a botany annex, was later removed to become a women's house. It's behind Pravina Covenant. And so this house, which was full of research details, a guy named Fuller was doing research there, a guy named Phillips was doing research on coal and the material that was in coal, the Carboniferous age. And so it was a historic building too. And it was also moved intact to a new location, and it allows people who are having family problems to have a place to live. And it doesn't look like it was a botany annex, but those of us who know really do know. So enough of Bill, but goodbye, Bill, and we really feel for what you've done and your family, and condolences to Jenny. And Jenny is keeps going with acting. She's a thespian. She directs plays. She writes plays, and she acts in plays. So I suspect Jenny will continue to keep the family together, and we will remember Bill. Okay, I have a whole bunch of other things here. We talked about Common Ground a little bit. That relates back to the Bill era. And then, oh dear, yes, I have a mop bucket. I'll put it up for people who are doing it.
While Dave grabs his equipment, the reason he's actually showing the bucket is because while you're listening right now on the radio, we're also making a video of this. If you tune in this Friday at 1 in the afternoon or next Tuesday at something like 6 in the evening, is that correct? You'll be able to see the video of this. And the reason that there is a video is not only because it's extra chances for folks to catch the show, but because, for example, you can see the sort of bucket that he's talking about, why somebody would throw something like this away when all it takes is a simple repair of wheels. When we're talking about the Greek Revival Cottage, we may well find pictures of it to show you it and the moving process, so you'll actually be able to see the enhanced multimedia version of the Prairie Monk show. And you've already put it down. I guess the folks who watch on the video will have seen it already. Yes, but anyway, so
sometimes it's easier for us to take a photograph and put the photograph in. Right. But the wheels have seized, and with a lot of equipment in office places, especially, hair gets into the into the wheel, and it is a matter. I've been researching this, and you can take the wheel apart. This is a rather special wheel. It has a plastic tire that doesn't make marks on the soil, and the bucket has baffles in it, so that when you move the mop bucket, the traditional problem with a mop bucket is that the water sloshes out onto the stuff that you've just done. So this is called a wave bucket. And I wondered why it was called a wave bucket. And I find out that it's a research. It's worth $153. It's 30 inches high. It's 20 inches long and 15 inches wide. And I called up the Rubbermaid people. The rubber and plastic is serious. So if it's going to go to the landfill, which was where it was destined to go, it's going to take 1,000 years to break down, not just 200. The wheels are $14.75 each. So if you have 4 wheels, that's $60. And then it's going to be $10 for the shipping. And then you've got to hope that you got the right wheel for the right model. So you have to go through these pages of, there are probably about 23 models of this machine. So you have to find the one you have. And then, is it justified to spend $60 on this piece of equipment? And what do you do with it if you don't do that? Do we throw it back into the landfill? We don't have anything that recycles hard plastic, so we don't really have a place for it to go. So you have to think about that. You can probably solve the hair situation by taking undone a bolt and releasing the material. And they told me that you can put it in warm water, and that allows you to get the hair out of it. But often we throw out a chair or something else like that just because the wheels are frozen, and then people will drag like the mop bucket along and make a flat surface on the tire, and so the tire's no use anymore. But the tire also has ball bearings in it, and the ball bearings are frozen, so you need something to free it up. So an hour of time spent on a few wheels, and you might have a $153 bucket, which is not going into the landfill.
So what do you intend to do with it then?
I don't know. I'm wondering if I pay almost $80 to restore it, can we sell it to someone who would use this rather modern bucket?
What if someone who's listening could use it and was willing to put in the time or the investment themselves?
Oh, that would be wonderful. We actually take things to Habitat for Humanity, and George Keefe used to put some of these things together, but apparently he's not doing that anymore. We really need to employ people who will repair things. But it's if you add your time up, it's going to cost a little bit. So it's probably cheaper to go buy a replacement.
Don't say that.
And throw this one out.
I just saw there's a simple screw on there. All you need is your standard, something to hold onto a bolt and something to twist, something to hold onto the nut, and you could undo that. And whether it's hot water or oil or whatever, somebody could. So don't forget to give your phone numbers if you're willing to turn it over to somebody who's willing to come get it and take care of it. And don't throw it away. If you're calling, you can't throw this away.
Okay, the phone numbers are 351-1911, area code 217-351-1911, or cell phone 840-1911.
And don't call those numbers now because we're not off the air for another 8 minutes.
And I have an email, which is monkdavid0@gmail.com. So, yes, if you're interested in the process of employing people, especially young people, who have to communicate with older people, it's like if you have a 1965 Chevy, you might want to find the gentleman who is 75 who knew how to work with that age of car, but then you need the young person with the muscles to lift and put this into action. And so there's a cooperation between generations there that we like to encourage. This week we had success with preserving plastic. I got another 2 big bags of nicely washed out plastic that now will go to recycle. It's food containers that can be recycled, and they don't have to go to Clinton to be in the landfill. And we know that there's still a battle about the landfill, so that we don't have PBCs from 5 states put into the Clinton landfill, because it generates money for a county that doesn't have a lot of money. So it was allowable, but the EPA details weren't covered. So there's a lot of debate about having this landfill on top of an aquifer that gives drinking water, good quality drinking water, to 850,000 people. So we don't want to send this piece of material to the landfill. So if anyone's interested, please give me a call, and I'll donate you a piece of material that came out of the garbage can. It's clean and it's okay. So also we were looking at A-grade paper. There were a couple of companies involved in the Lincoln building many years ago, and their paper has been there for a long time, and it's out of date, and the space is needed. So it was a matter of getting agencies to move this stuff. It could go directly to Clinton into the landfill, or it could be recycled. So I got involved in trying to get gondolas. I call them gondolas, but they're bigger than the regular garbage dumpster. A regular dumpster, a big dumpster, is 2 yards, and you get 4 yards and 6 yards, but then you get a big one. And this was rigged up with Tom Pantham, the manager of the Lincoln building, and they put a door as a run-up to dump the paper into to a 20-yard container. And 20 yards wasn't enough, so we got another container there at the moment for 20, and that 20 yards, that 40 yards of paper will go to recycling. Yay! So once again, we're looking at the local neighborhood. I was pleased that the St. Pat's Day didn't generate a whole bunch of aluminum in the garbage. That's Mike and Molly's has gotten very good at preserving the cans, and I hope that translates to other agencies that can preserve ingots of aluminum going to a landfill to sit there for a long time and not break down. So that's recyclable, and to recycle aluminum from cans is so much more efficient than to go back to bauxite that you can probably buy cheap from somewhere and create cans. But to create them from the can that's already in aluminum, that takes about 5% of the electricity that you would use if you're going to do it from bauxite. So enough. What else do I have here? Oh, wow. We had a field trip to the boneyard, and that's an experience for me. It happened fairly late. It was a class from the landscape architecture department, and they weren't sure we could do it on short notice. Could I help with that class? And I didn't get all the details. I wasn't quite sure. The aim of the class is to look how you could reestablish vegetation or establish vegetation on corridors like this. So my thought was to go do a field trip on the upper reaches of the boneyard, because the lower reaches are covered in, except for around the campus town where the boneyard has been exposed, and how do you beautify that? So I found it a very interesting class, and a young professor working with it. And we went to Scott Park to start with. Scott Park even had some ducks, not geese, but ducks. And we looked at the Big Dig, and had a couple of bicyclists, and they took off because they thought they knew where we were going. And it's kind of strange. Monkey and field trips don't go from A to B in a straight manner. They go around corners, and so if you decide that the end point is the point of interest, then you go straight to it. And 2 hours later, I'm coming around the corner, having looked at other things. So we tend to want to go across the Big Dig at White Street onto Logan Street to show people where the culverts are, that are man-sized culverts that allow water to come off the Champagne Marine from over there by Prospect Avenue, perhaps the best part of 2 miles, all the way to the Big Dig. That's the main purpose of this area. That doesn't have a lot of above-ground stuff, but it has all sorts of people who've been encouraged to put in rain gardens, so the water settles in and doesn't have to run off. So we looked at the other part that goes up through the north end, across the railroad line where there's a detention pond, and over towards Kmart where there's a bypass. So some of the boneyard water goes to the Salt Fork, and some of it comes down the boneyard. So could you resurrect and put more water through? That was a question. Then we looked at the headwaters, and we looked at detention ponds, and it was an interesting field trip. The next day, the Natural Area Study Group had a field trip there, and the day before was 70 degrees, wonderful sunlight, no wind, and the next day was cold and windy. And so we did the field trip. There were 15 or more people there. I'm surprised. We put this thing together as a docent group some almost 35 years ago, and it's still operating, and these people get to know areas so that they can teach others. So we treated to the...
That's it.
That's it.
That's all, folks. Okay. Sorry, I've been gesturing over here, but Dave gets into these things, which he needs to, because obviously we need more people like him out there putting this stuff out there. And speaking of that, the views and opinions expressed are solely those that you hear on the air.